Hello everyone, this learning module is on common schools and modernization. This video is meant to accompany it. I want to provide some larger contextual background in terms of the period, early 1800s. By 1825, 1830, public schools in America, what there were of them, there were very few, were in extremely poor condition. Largest reason for this is they were not adequately funded. Support was sometimes from very small local taxes. There might be some support from legislatures, perhaps even land grants, but it was generally accepted at the time that the education of children was the responsibility of the parents. And there's evidence in this in the small number of private schools, the large number of private schools that developed across the country. Most of these were denominational, private institutions in nature, usually affiliated with the local church. But this number of private schools, the fact that they were almost ubiquitous, was also a disincentive for legislatures to provide additional money for public schools. Part of what started the public school movement, and there were several things. One of these was the American Lyceum, spelled Lyceum. It was one of the earliest and most effective agencies to influence school reform. It was established in Massachusetts in 1826. Its mission was the organization of public education, advancement of education, particularly common schools, or what we think of now as public schools. They also helped develop libraries, provided informational meeting on education, also held scientific demonstrations, really what we would call today outreach. And this served to raise awareness among the public for the need for common schools and support for education. Several leaders of educational reform, these came mainly from clergy and some legislators as well. They tended to be college educated and were characterized by a sense of humanitarianism. Humanitarianism means looking outward for life's questions, but also trying to advance education as a common good rather than as an individual benefit. Their objective was to develop an educated citizenry. One of the things Thomas Jefferson is best remembered for was having said that an ignorant citizenry, an uneducated citizenry, are a danger to a democracy. But leaders in educational reform felt that this widespread education could only be attained by a system of public schools administered by the state. So very much a public orientation and linked to the state. As we've talked about before so many times, one of the characteristics of education as it grows and evolves is its role in satisfying the public policy needs, laws, social stability, but the needs of the state. And this is an excellent example of how that happens. One of the leading figures was Horace Mann. He came from a family with a very strong Puritan ancestry. He attended Brown University, one of the oldest higher education institutions in the United States, then went into law. He was elected to the state legislature in Massachusetts. And while in the state legislature, he helped establish the first Board of Education. He then left his seat in the legislature and became the Massachusetts Secretary of Education in 1837. Unfortunately, his job had little authority, very little support of the people. His job, essentially, was to try and convince the citizenry. Unfortunately, there was a lot of resistance. The wealthy, in particular, objected to raising taxes. Churches were also opposed to schools without a religious oversight. So he was in office for about 12 years. Unfortunately, he did not accomplish a lot, but he did make some really noticeable achievements. He was able to increase funding for education. The schools that were built were cleaner and safer. In fact, he was able to establish also 3 normal schools, what we would call teacher preparation schools. So there's some standardization of teaching methods. He might have been able to accomplish a lot more with a more supportive legislature and a more supportive citizenry, but given what he had to work with, it was remarkable. Another was Henry Barnard. This was in Connecticut in 1838. The Connecticut legislature created a board of education, and Henry Barnard was its first secretary of education. Barnard also had a legal background, practiced law, having attended Yale University. Similar problems in Connecticut as in Massachusetts. Resistant to taxes to support education eventually led to the dismantling of the Department of Education in 1842, only 4 years after it had been established. However, 4 years later, 1846, the legislature realized their mistake and invited him to return and continue as Secretary of Education. By this time, he was able to establish a centralized control, state control of public education. He was also able to establish a tax base for schools and raise public support for public education. During this time, one of the real challenges were rate bills, eliminating rate bills and switching to a tax base, a public tax base, as support for public education. Rate bills had been up to this time the most common way to pay for schools. Parents paid an amount in proportion to the number of children they sent to schools or the number of days they attended. Urban areas with large numbers of children were the first to find this system inadequate. Efforts to eliminate rate bills were linked with school funding and shifting to a general tax. The idea, the theory behind this was that public education was not simply a benefit to the child, it was also a benefit to society. It was considered by advocates as a social good. It benefited everyone. Therefore, it was only logical that everyone contribute in terms of taxes to public education. However, it was difficult to convince people that this was a good idea to support a general tax. So it took from 1832 to 1867 for most northern and eastern states to make the transition. A few continued to hold out, such as Connecticut, Rhode Island, Michigan, New Jersey. Eventually, though, they did also switch to a general tax for public education. Another way to support education were through endowment funds, permanent endowment funds. Now, by 1834, nearly all northeastern states had established endowment funds for schools. Money for endowment funds was collected through tax sales, such as liquor licenses, marriage fees, dog taxes. I've never heard of a dog tax. Lottery funds. However, the funding was just too little to support any kind of large-scale effort or reform. Some states, such as Delaware, the funds were allowed to accumulate over time before being apportioned to schools. Again, what that meant was schools had to wait long periods of time, occasionally, to receive funding, and what they did was still inadequate. Other states, particularly those in the Appalachian regions, Appalachian Mountains, funds were developed from the sale of lands, public lands, consisting of 1/16 of the section of each township. They would sell the land and then use the money from that, the proceeds, to fund education. Some were more effective than others at doing so. Some towns were very smart in terms of how they sold the land and used the money well, invested well, used some return to support public schools. Others were not as were not as wise in terms of how they disposed of the property. Sometimes for very little money, very quickly, and then it was just gone. In some cases, lands were stripped of their natural resources before sale. The forestry, timber, could have been removed before sale, making the land of little or often no market value. Investments from the sales were poorly invested in many cases, sometimes lost. And some legislatures borrowed the funds and used them for other purposes, which was illegal. Therefore, in none of the states did permanent endowment funds from the sale of lands prove to be adequate or successful. Why was this the case? Well, several reasons. Many people didn't want or trust powerful government. You have to keep in mind this is an era where there was still a very strong debate over the rights of the states versus the federal government. And many people, particularly in the South, preferred that their states have the authority to make these decisions. Many, on the other hand, didn't want any government involvement and wanted to be left entirely alone. Also, it's difficult to persuade people to institute taxes or raise taxes. I think if you watch the news lately, we've recently entered into that discussion again with a possible reduction of middle class taxes and how the government can afford doing so. These discussions never really end. They just continue in different places, in different times, in different contexts. But the idea that the wealth of the state should be used to educate the children of the state was really fought over, as you can see, for much of the 19th century. The arguments for public education. One is that education is the right of every child, that it's not simply a benefit, not just a luxury, but in what we would call today a human right. Another argument in advance of public education was that it supports the interests of the state to have an educated citizenry in order to perpetuate itself. This is not exactly an altruistic reason. It's based on the needs of the state and social stability, but that is how governments work. As I mentioned before, keep in mind the first job of any government, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but really the first priority of any government is to stay in power. And one of the best ways to do that is through social stability. Another reason in support of public education, that it would prevent crime, reduce poverty, and these are very compelling arguments, break down class distinctions, and provide instruction free from religious bias. Objections to public education. Public education by many was seen as a useless visionary idea with little prospect of success. Others objected to it because it would put a burden on everyone for taxes, not simply parents with children, but everyone. But this idea is based on the assumption that education is a common good. Linked to this were many people's objections that the state, they felt, had no right to tax one person to pay for another person's education. Again, this is linked to the idea of education being a common good. Objection to that idea. Many also objected. They felt it was wrong essentially to make a person pay twice. For example, if they sent their child to a private school, then they also had to pay for public school support. People were essentially being charged twice. Others were concerned it would undermine private schools and not provide what many felt were much needed religious education to develop moral character. Keep in mind, we're still having that discussion even now, 150 years later. Other objections were that if education had to try and appeal to the masses, then it would lower the level of rigor and reduce education to a level of mediocrity. These are the arguments against. So, as you can see, though, some of these arguments are still very much debated here now. The idea of education being a public good, I think, has largely been settled. But there are still some objections people raise, particularly in terms of having people taxed twice, what some would say, those who go to private schools, or people who don't have children at all contributing. Some still object to that. But largely this debate has been settled. At any rate, this gives you a really good historical understanding of the objections toward public education and the challenges that advocates such as Horace Mann, Henry Bernard had to deal with in the process. Well, as usual, I will be around, typically here every day. If you have a question, always, please feel free to email, call, or make an appointment to visit me. I know my office hours are Monday, Wednesday, 12 to 3, but I'm here pretty much every day, so I can accommodate your schedule easily. As usual, I'll be in touch. Bye for now.